gracias. Quiero empezar por decirles que realmente lamento mucho no estar allí, sino esta representación.
Bardzo mi przykro, że nie mogę być teraz z Państwem.
An unfortunate event that I cannot
Mamy do
be
dyspozycji
with
jedynie
you.
ten ekran.
We only have
Bardzo
a
mi
screen,
przykro z tego powodu.
And you can see me only on the screen, which is really
Pojechałem na
something
madryckie
that makes
lotnisko
me
wczoraj
unhappy. I went to the Madrid
i już
airport
wsiadałem na
yesterday,
pokład
and I was
właściwie,
actually already boarding the plane.
kiedy powiedziano mi,
When
że
someone
nie
said
mogę
to me
przejść,
that I couldn't get on the plane
dlatego że był problem z moim
because there was some
wózkiem.
sort of an issue with my wheelchair.
Así que bueno, hablaré.
Dlatego też
So
musimy zadowolić się
we have to make
tym
do
kanałem
with what we
komunikacji,
have, and we have to
a ja
communicate
przedstawię
remotely, online. Let me tell you and let me give you an abbreviated version of my lecture, because a video connection instead of being with you in person, well, it's not the best of solutions.
Leyéndoles un fragmento muy breve de un libro
I would like to start by
7 u 8 años.
reading a fragment of my book.
Es un libro raro porque
It's a book that I wrote 7 to 8 years ago.
en castellano. Yo hice una edición
Well,
que
that book was not published in Spanish.
cumplí 60 años.
Actually, that book was something that I was giving out to my friends when I turned 60. So actually, the only language in which it appeared, in which it was published, was Polish. And it was a conscious decision. Maybe someday I will publish it in Spanish, but I wanted to start with the Polish version as a tribute to my grandfather, Vicente, who was actually born in Warsaw.
Él se fue porque creía que era polaco y le hicieron notar que sobre todo era judío, esto en los años 20.
He left because he felt Polish, but he was always being told he was Jewish, and all he wanted to do was to just get to the bottom of his own identity that was a little bit complex. So my grandfather, Vicente, he knew that his brother, who had been a physician, he worked at the Warsaw Ghetto right till the end, or almost till the end. And he tended to the sick who could only be cured with food. So he tended to patients who suffered from hunger disease. He was among physicians who were aware of the fact that they may not live, but still he did his research, and his research could give an opportunity to other people to survive. People who lived without a future. It was their final effort as they were facing death. As they were waiting for death to come, they decided not to leave their work behind and not to leave their patients behind. Well, and we learned about the work that he'd been doing thanks to the fact that the results of his studies were smuggled outside of the ghetto, and then in 1946 his results were published in the States. So the brother, my grandfather's brother, managed to escape Warsaw together with his wife, who was also a physician. They went underground, they were in the resistance movement, they were fighting against Germans, and they were fighting in the Warsaw Rising when Warsaw decided to face its occupant. And then the Russians were waiting on the border of the city, allowing Germans to kill 20,000 people in the resistance movement. So actually Barnau, the brother of my grandfather Vicente, died back then. So that was a fragment from my book,
escucharlos y aprender más
and
sobre
hopefully
esa historia
it
que
gives you a little
también
bit of
es
insight
parte
into my
de la
motives
historia de mi
and a little
familia.
bit of insight why I so much wanted to be with you in person and to be
Tiene
able to
sentido,
share
por
things with you
supuesto,
in person.
hablar del hambre hoy y hablar en Varsovia,
Okay, so I
porque
think that today we need
probablemente
to
en el
talk
último
about hunger.
siglo, en ningún
We need
lugar
to
de
talk about
Occidente el
hunger
hambre fue tan
in
brutal
Warsaw.
y tan
I would
concentrado
say
como en
in the
esta
last
ciudad,
century,
o más
probably
bien en un
in no
barrio
other
de esta
place
ciudad, en
in
el
the
gueto
Western
de
world
Varsovia.
was
Ustedes lo saben
hunger
perfectamente,
no
hay muy pocos
more
lugares en el
present
mundo
than
donde
here
la política
in
del
Warsaw.
hambre se haya
And there are
aplicado
very
de una
few
forma
places
tan
all around the world
sistemática y tan
where
extrema como aquí en
a
Varsovia, en su
policy
gueto.
of hunger
Y por eso en ningún lugar de
was
Occidente
used
se
and
estudió el
wielded
hambre
so
de una
systematically
forma tan
against
intensa como lo hicieron
populations
aquellos
as in
médicos
Warsaw.
del hospital del
Additionally,
gueto,
it was
de
here in
una forma
Warsaw
tan
where
conmovedora como
hunger
lo hicieron aquellos
and
médicos.
hunger disease
Y por
were
eso
studied
también me emociona
very
que sea la
thoroughly
estar hoy
thanks
aquí
to the
para
very
hablar
body
de
of
esto.
work of the physicians I just mentioned.
Ustedes saben, y es un pequeño
And that's why
prólogo,
I'm
que las
here,
tres
and
mayores
we're talking
hambrunas
about
de los últimos 100 años fueron causadas por la política. En Ucrania, a fines de los 20, principios de los 30, bajo el régimen de
Bouts of
Stalin.
hunger
En
over the
Varsovia,
last
en
century were
1941,
caused by
43,
politicians.
bajo
Ukraine in the
la
30s,
ocupación
Warsaw
alemana,
in the
en
years
China,
41,
en
43 due to
1958,
German
con
occupation,
aquella
and in China in the year
desafortunada política del gran
1958.
salto hacia adelante que decidió el
And that
presidente Mao
was
Zedong y que causó un número desconocido de
That was
muertos,
the very
quizás
leap of
30
progress
millones,
that Mao
35 millones, nadie
dictated.
lo sabe
And actually,
a
it's
ciencia
been
cierta
estimated
porque
that
esto
that
se
particular
ocultó
policy
durante
led
muchos
to
años, durante mucho
the
tiempo.
death of
Les-
tens of
les
thousands of
cuento así
people,
entre
but actually it's
paréntesis
very
que
difficult
mi
to
libro
estimate,
sobre el
and
hambre
this
se
hunger
publicó en China,
lingered for a very long time, for
pero
years.
censuraron
And my book,
las
by the
dos
way,
o tres
the one
páginas
about
que
hunger,
hablaban de
was actually
la gran
published in
hambruna
China,
de fines de los
but
50
actually
y
it was
principios de los
censored.
60 en ese país.
And and the chapter
Saben lo que
about
hacen,
the great
sentido.
hunger in
Pero
China
todo
in the
esto para
50s and the
decirles
60s,
que
that was
ahora
actually
el hambre
the
es
part that they
distinto.
censored.
Ya
And
no
the Chinese,
son
they know what they're doing
hambrunas,
when they
grandes
censor some
hambrunas
work. But
puntuales,
today, when we
como
talk
las
about
que
hunger,
en
we're
general
not talking
sucedieron
about
en el mundo
concentrated
desde quizás el
masses of
principio de
people,
los tiempos
just
hasta
like
hace unas
our
pocas
history
décadas.
saw.
Lo que pasa ahora,
decades
insisto,
ago.
ya no son esas grandes
Today,
hambrunas puntuales que
we
se
are
deben
not
a una
dealing
crisis,
with great
a una
periods of
crisis
hunger.
política, una crisis meteorológica,
So
una
even a
crisis
political
ambiental,
crisis or a climate crisis or an environmental crisis, they
que
would
son
not
el
lead
hambre ahora en el mundo
to
es el efecto
huge
devastador de la
hunger.
carencia continuada,
But today,
de un sistema en el cual
hunger
la carencia
does
está
affect people
establecida,
due
la carencia de
to
comida, de
persistent scarcity
por
of food,
supuesto.
scarcity that is
Esa
driven
carencia
by politics.
también es causada por la política, pero por una forma distinta de
And
la política.
this persistent scarcity of
Hace unos
food
años, cuando
is dictated or driven
decidí,
by a different
emprender este trabajo sobre el hambre,
way
como
of running state policy.
como intentado,
When years
pensado,
ago I decided
deseado
to
durante
write
mucho
this book
tiempo,
about hunger,
eh,
I'd been thinking
imaginé
about
que
it for a
para
long time.
entender
And I'd been
los
wondering
mecanismos del hambre en el mundo,
that maybe
me
in order to
servían dos
understand
premisas
the
fundamentales.
phenomenon of hunger all around the
Una
world,
es que
I
no
should be
existe
making
el hambre en el mundo.
two assumptions. First of all, that
800, 900 mil
world
millones de
hunger
personas que
is
no
not a
comen
thing.
suficiente,
There's no such thing
lo
as
cual
world
parece lo
hunger.
mismo, pero es muy diferente, y que sí,
There are 800, 900
yo
people
quería que
who
el
don't
lector
get
y
enough
yo mismo
nutrition, who
pudiéramos
don't get enough
entender cómo
food.
es
True.
eso, tenía que contar
But I wanted to
algunas de
understand how that
algunas
worked,
historias
and I wanted to
de esas
explain that
personas
to my
para
readers.
tratar de saber cómo se vive
Why this is happening.
sin
And I
saber
wanted to tell
si vas
that
a comer al
through
día
life
siguiente.
stories of those very people who
Eso
did
por
not have
supuesto
enough food.
suponía el peligro
How
de
it
caer en
feels
esa
to live
pornografía
with
de
the
la
knowledge
miseria.
that you may not be
Que hace
eating
que
the following
el
day.
lector
You
consiga
have to somehow-
emocionarse 10 minutos, se sienta bueno
You
porque
have
se
to
emociona
somehow
y
try not
al cabo de un
to
rato se
give
olvida
in
de
to
todo.
emotional
Ese es el mecanismo de cualquier
exhibitionism,
forma
where
que
you
se
want to
preste
shock your readers
por
for a
pornografía.
while and then they'll move on to forget about it, because this is what happens with exhibitionists or with pornography. There is a strong shock, but it dissipates very quickly. And then there was another assumption that I made. Namely, as I said, there is no world hunger as such, but there is a certain confluence of events leading to the fact that certain people don't get enough food. And I knew that if I wouldn't explain it properly, readers would not be able to digest it and would not be able to take it with them, to carry it with them for a longer time. And I always thought that if you understand a certain topic, if you really understand it, you will be unable to forget about it. Real deep understanding of things leads to the fact that you're not just dealing with sad events or sad life stories. There's more to this. And it's easier to understand certain things knowing how these things and mechanisms affect living human beings. Therefore, I described life stories of people who suffered from hunger, and I juxtaposed it against hard data and numbers. But it was all very complicated, and probably I will go on to say it many times still. But it turns out that today, in today's world, there is no greater shame than that we accept the fact that 800, 900 million people suffer from hunger out there, even though there is enough food to go around for everyone easily. So to just make a quick remark, usually you think about hunger in conjunction with poverty, but let me tell you the opposite. Hunger results from wealth, from the fact that wealth is concentrated, consolidated in certain hands. There is food wealth. There are countries or sectors of the economy that collect, consolidate their food and nutritional wealth. And because of that, some other people have no access to the food that they need. So again, let me stress, hunger is not caused by poverty, it's caused by wealth. The fact that food is being made not to nourish people, but it's being made instead to make money. Often we don't think about it this way, but we should. I talked about the very shame. This shame comes from the fact that the world could easily feed everyone on the planet. And that's something new in human history. There always comes a moment that can be a turning point. And I think it's one of the more important moments in our history that we never paid attention to. It's even hard to tell when it occurred. But let me tell you when. Well, it was more or less in the 70s, 80s of the last century. Thanks to technological progress, thanks to agricultural production, thanks to the Green Revolution. For the first time in human history, the planet could feed all its inhabitants. So theoretically, as I said, we could feed 11 billion people. We have 8 billion people in the world. And among them, nearly 1 billion suffer from food scarcity, even though we could feed all of them. In order to get a deeper understanding of that, one would have to wonder and delve into the dynamics of it. Why this is happening, what mechanisms are in play, and where it leads. When I talk about concentration or consolidation of food and nutritional wealth, what I mean by that is that in big parts of the world, agricultural production is not there to feed the world, but simply to supply to the wealthy, affluent markets. In my country, in Argentina, it's a great example because my country is right now in the midst of great difficulties. But what can we do? We really know how to produce food. We are traditional, we have been a great major manufacturer of foods. The food that we manufacture could feed 400 million people, and our population in Argentina is 45 million. But among them, nearly 4 million are malnourished. How come? How is this possible that in a country that manufactures so much food, there are some people going hungry? It is a great example of that agricultural production in Argentina is meant mostly is focused mostly on soybeans that go to China. So actually, Argentina makes food in order to feed the production of other kinds of food in China. So this potential is used for profits, greatest possible profits for manufacturers. There is an example, a model that may be simplified, but it well explains the very concentration of food and nutritional wealth. I call it the cow model. So if you have a farmer who produces food, who has 10 kilograms of grains. Those 10 kilograms of grains could go to two purposes. So the grain could be, 1 kilogram of his grain. Maybe the farmer could sell, and he could sell it to 10 different families, or he could take the whole 10 kilograms and sell it to a beef manufacturer who would take the 10 kilograms of grain to feed his cows, to make meat. And from 10 kilograms of grain, he will produce 1 kilogram of meat. And actually, this 1 kilogram of meat can be sold to only 2 families, and each of them will get half a kilo. So in this whole cycle, we are dealing with people who make money, who stand to gain from selling the grain, from breeding animals, being a butcher. But actually, as a result of this, 8 families are not getting food. Only 2 families are sharing 1 kilogram of meat, and the rest are not getting anything. So that's how food and nutritional wealth gets consolidated.
This is very schematic, but I think this vividly illustrates this problem. And that's the way it looks in various sectors, and it leads to precisely that disgrace, consisting in that so many people don't get enough food. So hunger is not something intended. No one says, I'm gonna starve my citizens. Okay, it was the German Nazis' plan. It was their political and military intention, but these days, hunger is not an intended activity. This is rather a side harm stemming from the will to make money. Today's owners of the world are not interested in disseminating hunger. Not really. They're also not very much interested in eliminating hunger. They're first and foremost about gain. And the example that I also analyzed at length in my book is Bangladesh, where the textile sector is very much developed. Over the last 20 years, they became the second largest manufacturer of clothes. They produce for all the major European and American companies, and this was possible owing to the exploitation of the workforce. First of all, women. 5-6 million women work for $20-25 a month. And why do they earn $20-25 for incessant work, actually? Because the alternative for them is starvation. So here, that hunger is used, and it works to the benefit of the exploiters, those who exploit those females. So actually, these are side effects or consequential damages stemming from the situation. You could quote the example of Nigeria. That country is among the poorest ones in the world. The UN and other organizations mention that. Sorry, it's Niger. It's Niger. When we talk about Niger, we're talking about structural things. It's well known that famine strikes there, and when I was there, I thought that the structural poverty was quite obvious. The land is infertile. The only thing they can produce are cereals that have a very low calorific and nutritional value. This can only be used mostly as animal, or actually poultry, feed. So it seems natural that famine can occur there and that it's a structural phenomenon, because we're saying that something is structural, it cannot be changed. I thought so up to the moment when I found out that Niger was the second largest producer of uranium in the world. Uranium is a very valuable element, but Niger does not earn money on uranium, because the ones who earn money on it are the mining companies from France and from China, and these two capital groups compete with each other, compete for the president's favor, and it turns out that no one wants to take advantage of it, to use money that would enable Niger to build the entire infrastructure, road infrastructure, using machines and means of production that would enable them to feed all their citizens. Because they say that in Niger, famine has a structural nature. That is true, but it doesn't stem from the structure of farming. It stems from the global economy. Such structures that enable the exploitation of such a country. In Warsaw, wherever you are, and I wish so much that I could be there, there's a little monument, I forget where it is. It's a place around the old town, just off the river. There's a monument that was funded by the French company that exploits uranium in Niger. So it even bears fruit. That exploitation even brings some benefits to Warsaw. Like I mentioned, food is not only produced for profit rather than for feeding the population. Also, over the last 30 years, significant changes have occurred. It is connected with the discovery from the 1990s, when as privatization took place and neoliberalism was implemented, that was predominant. Speculators and banks discovered that food was a great way of speculation by issuing all sorts of bonds, shares, and other securities. Before, that thing also existed, but the Chicago Exchange became the center of speculation in farming products. That's where prices for those commodities are defined not because of the need or the demand. It's about the play of supply and demand. All those businesses that use very sophisticated investment instruments to sell some tons of corn or rice. All this could be a game that they play with each other. However, the problem is that all the increases on the Chicago Commodities Exchange rebound or reverberate globally. When there was this very significant food price increase, it was around 2008, 10, 9, when also the banking crisis hit and numerous speculative operations were taking place, all the mortgage stuff and such like. It also hit the Chicago Commodities Exchange, and the US government appropriated major funds to bail out banks, to ensure liquidity to them, and such funds were also appropriated to the Chicago Exchange. However, that meant that a month later, the turnover of that exchange increased by 50%, and in 2011 there was the Arab Spring, and people protested because they had no money to buy food for their families. So such speculation brings effects that clearly affect the reality and the food necessities. We also have a very recent example of that, all of you. I'm sure you all experienced Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This also caused such speculations. Russia invaded Ukraine, and that also causes economic effects. Those two countries produce a total of 13% of the global wheat production. Therefore, problems occur in the supply of wheat. Today, the wheat prices have gone up by over 50%. However, why so much if we're only talking about that percentage of Russia's and Ukraine's share in the global production, let alone the fact that the production of wheat is still in progress in those two countries. It's just an excuse to enable wheat price increases, sunflower oil price increases. The production in Ukraine dropped by 3%, 3% only vis-a-vis the global production, so it does not explain the increase by 50%. However, the threat of war enabled the speculative increases in those prices by such a percentage.
de que no, bueno, hay una guerra,
It's
entonces los
so
alimentos
easy
tienen que
to
aumentar porque
persuade
hay una
us
guerra.
all,
Bueno, sí,
war,
5%,
the food prices
10%
have to go up.
es
Yes,
proporcional
5%,
a
10%,
aquellos
so
que no van a
proportionately
ser,
to
que
the
no van a
losses
poder producirse,
that
no esa
the war
desproporción, sin
can
duda.
cause
En fin,
and
esto
the drop
quería
in the production
decirles
involved.
como ejemplo de cómo esto se maneja. Y lo
That was just
curioso
an
es que,
example of
como
such
les decía hace un
mechanisms.
rato,
There's one more
tenemos
interesting fact. I
todos
mentioned
los
it before.
elementos, los medios técnicos para conseguir
We have
que
all the tools in
coman
place
todos los ciudadanos, todas las
to
personas que
feed
viven en el mundo.
all the global
Eso está,
citizens,
es decir, no
all the
es
people
no sería
living
un
in the
problema.
world.
Durante milenios
That's just
fue
a
un
fact.
problema.
It's
O
not
sea,
a problem.
siempre hubo una
It's not a problem
acumulación
as
de riquezas
such.
y
For thousands of
por supuesto
years,
también de riqueza
there used to be
alimentaria
a problem. The
hace por
accumulation
lo
of
menos 4 o
capital,
5.000
accumulation
años.
of food,
Pero además de eso estaba el problema meramente técnico, que
4 or
las sociedades
5,000
no eran
years
capaces de producir
constituted
suficientes alimentos
a
para
major
todos. Ahora,
problem.
insisto, lo son. Entonces,
And
no alimentar a todos es una gran decisión política.
societies basically did not
O sea,
produce
quiero
enough
decir, no, es
food
una gran
to feed
decisión
everyone. Today,
política.
the
Aquellos
situation is
que
different.
de
Today,
distintas
famine
maneras y con
stems
distintos
from
discursos
political decisions,
manejan el mundo, no
decisions of grave
han tomado
importance.
nunca la decisión
You control the
de
discourse
utilizar
in a
esos medios
determined
técnicos que
way.
tenemos para solucionar esa gran
Today,
vergüenza del hambre.
Basically, no political decisions are made to resolve the problem of malnutrition of a certain number of people. Why don't we do it? I have at least 60 different suggestions. But let's perhaps list 2 or 3 that I wish are the most
y es muy obvio, por
correct
los
ones.
intereses que habría que afectar, digamos.
First of all,
Los productores y los
It's
traficantes
about
de alimentos son
the
grandes
producers
jugadores
and
en
food dealers'
la
interests that would suffer. These
estructura
are
económica
major
globalizada
players.
y
These
ningún
are
gobierno, muy
huge
pocos gobiernos
economic
quieren
global
tener ningún conflicto
players.
con ellos, ni les interesa porque ellos forman parte,
Governments
digamos, de esa
have no way of standing up to
entonces,
them.
para empezar, no toman esa
Or they have
decisión
no interest
política
in that because they are part of the mechanism. Hence,
esto forma
lack of
parte
political
de sus porque
decisions.
mantenerlo forma parte de sus decisiones
That lack,
políticas o de su idea de cómo debe
that
ser
indecision
el mundo.
is part of
Y más en general,
the active
más allá de
policy
gobiernos y
pursued
grandes
by
poderes, yo
global
creo
governments,
que a la
other
mayoría de
than
nosotros
governmental
tampoco
issues or
se nos
those
ocurre
involving major
tengamos que
superpowers.
insistir
Ourselves.
en la solución de esta vergüenza, básicamente
We don't
por una cosa muy menor, una
come up with
tonta quizás,
the ideas
que es que el
to
hambre en general le
stand up
sucede a
for
otros.
such
El hambre es algo
solutions
que
for a
no nos
very
pasa.
basic reason, because
Yo no sé,
hunger
pueden
affects someone
hacer
else.
examen.
It's not
Si
us
conocen
who suffers
gente
the
que
hunger.
haya muerto de hambre, que haya
Think about
muerto por no
Do you
comer
know
lo
someone
suficiente.
who has
Yo creo que
starved?
muy pocos de nosotros conocemos alguno.
Is there
Y si lo
anyone
conocemos es porque
among
hemos ido
your
a verlo, a
circle of
buscarlo, lo que
relations
sea.
who would die because they
Afortunadamente,
didn't get
también
enough
en
food?
nuestras generaciones eso ya no sucede en Occidente.
Our
Entonces,
generations
y
have
en
not
otros países más o
experienced
menos
that, at least not in the
prósperos
West.
del mundo. Y eso hace que no nos importe
Or
tanto.
in
Lamentablemente, eso hace que no nos importe tanto.
other
Yo
more
muchas
or
veces a
less
ese respecto
wealthy countries
pienso
of the
en la
world.
ecología.
Hence,
¿no?
we don't care all that
Cuando
much.
yo empecé la facultad
On top of
en
that, we
París en
have
el
the
año
issue of
76,
environmental
hace milenios,
protection in
Eh,
1976.
allí en mi
That's to say,
facultad había un
ages
pequeño
ago when I
grupo de
started
ecologistas que
my
eran
university
bien, nadie les hacía mucho
in
caso,
Paris.
hablaban un poco,
There were
ponían
about
carteles,
10 or
de vez en
15
cuando gritaban algo,
ecologists
nadie les hacía caso.
who
En estos
shouted
50 años
or organized
consiguieron
protests. No one paid
convencernos,
attention to them.
de
And
que
for
su
50 years that have
reivindicación era
passed since,
decisiva. Y ahora uno ya no
those
puede,
people
una
persuaded
persona ya
us
no puede presentarse
that
para
they
ningún
were right.
cargo público ni alcalde de,
Today,
de una pequeña ciudad
no
sin
one
explicar cómo va a salvar el medio ambiente.
can run
¿Por qué es eso? Básicamente
for
porque
any
consiguieron convencernos
position, even in
de
the
que
smallest
la degradación del medio ambiente es algo
municipality,
que nos
without
afecta
declaring
a
that they
todos.
would save the natural environment, because we've been persuaded that the degradation of the natural
Nuestros hijos, por supuesto, y a todos los
environment
demás.
affects everyone, not only those who suffer hunger, but everyone,
Es un
us and
problema,
our
es
children.
difícil, porque es muy fácil pensar, insisto, porque es cierto que el hambre es algo que les pasa a otros y que por lo tanto
How can we
no tiene por qué
eliminate
preocuparnos tanto.
hunger?
Es muy curioso que
Well,
la
it's
preocupación
not
ambiental, que es
our
muy real y
concern,
que hay que
because
mantener,
we don't care because it
tiene
doesn't
que ver
affect
con
us,
la
it
amenaza
affects other
de lo que
people.
puede llegar a pasar
Concerns of
si no lo evitamos
climate
dentro
changes
de
and the
20,
environment
30, 40 años, cuando
are connected with
puede producir,
threats that in 20, 30, or
situaciones muy
40
duras.
years
El hambre no va a pasar
will
dentro de
affect us
20,
all.
30, 40 años. Está pasando todos los días. Está pasando
And
ahora. Y sin
will
embargo,
then
no es algo de lo que nos
lead
ocupemos.
to tremendous situations, and famine is what happens today,
Que
and
eso tiene que ver
even
también
so, it's not our
con que
major concern.
esta es una época que no sabe pensar su futuro, que no sabe
It seems
imaginar
to me
su futuro,
that it's
y
also
que por eso le
connected
teme.
with the fact that
Yo
these days
creo,
we could not imagine our future,
idea
and that's why
que tengo bastante
we're concerned about
arraigada,
it.
que a lo largo de la historia, y eso se ve
I'm
cuando uno mira
convinced
un poco
that
lo que ha ido pasando, hay
as
momentos en los
the
que
time goes by,
las
you
sociedades,
can
cada
see
sociedad
that
tiene una
there have been moments
idea
in
de
history
futuro
where
claro, un proyecto de futuro
societies
claro, y
imagined
momentos
their
en que no lo
futures
tienen.
in a way, in a given way. They had
Construir un proyecto de futuro es algo que
projections
tarda
of their
décadas.
future, and there were moments when they had no such projections.
Y que en algún
To
momento
devise
cristaliza
a
y
future is a
consigue
process that
convencer
takes decades or even
grandes
centuries.
partes de las sociedades de que
However,
vale la pena
at the end of the day,
trabajar,
such
hacer lo
things happen,
necesario,
and a
hacer lo
major part of
posible
the
por
society
ese futuro.
start believing that it makes sense to start working on a certain
revoluciones
vision
burguesas
of the future.
y democráticas que
I have some
empezaron
obvious
a fines del
examples,
siglo XVIII y duraron
like revolutions of
siguientes,
the end of
y después la
the
segunda
18th century.
ola, que fue las
We can be
revoluciones
also
socialistas,
talking about
y
yet
demás.
another
Esta
wave
última
that
ola,
happened
que
during the
hace
socialist
relativamente
revolution,
poco,
and there were
fracasó,
more.
sabemos,
And the
casi
latest
todo,
wave
y estamos en un
that
momento
hit
en que
us
nuestro
quite
último
recently,
proyecto de
and it
futuro,
ended
bueno,
with a
ese
disaster.
futuro que fracasó.
And right
Y
now,
todavía no hemos
we
tenido,
are facing the
el
latest
tiempo y la
project of the future. I mean, we have to conceptualize it, we have to conceive it, but we still don't know.
En que nuestras sociedades no consiguen imaginar
So
cuál
right
sería
now,
un futuro deseable.
we're at a
Y
crossroads.
entonces,
Our
como no
societies
pueden
have no
desear
idea
el futuro,
about their
lo
future
que hacen
and
en
what
general es
future
temerlo. Como no puede
awaits
ser una
us.
promesa,
And
se
if they
convierte
don't
en una
know
amenaza.
where to go,
Ahora,
what
siempre
to
que
strive for,
pensamos en el futuro, no
they start
pensamos
being
en
afraid
términos
because
de
what
amenaza.
could be a promise
Pensamos en la amenaza
becomes a threat.
ambiental de la que hablábamos recién,
Usually,
en la amenaza
you don't think
demográfica,
about the
en la amenaza
future this way.
política, en la
You may
amenaza
think
incluso de
about
la
threats,
inteligencia artificial,
climate-related
lo que puede
threats,
hacer con lo que puede hacer la
policy-related
tecnología.
threats, demographic threats, AI could pose a threat. Everything that we think about in the context of our future seems like a threat because we don't know how to make that a promise. And this fear takes a lot of time and energy, but also figuring out our future will take failures, it will take trial and error. There's no one single generation that will figure out the future. Things will have to, ideas will have to clash, and in the end, people will have to agree on a version of a future. Maybe I will not be there to witness it, but let me stress what I just said. Namely, we are living in times where we cannot even imagine or conceptualize our future. We cannot even be bothered to think how we're going to shape our future, what it's going to look like, and how we're going to feed 900 million people who are suffering from hunger today. These times, they are worrying, fraught, and well, it would be so much nicer to live in a time where everyone knows where they're going, rather than all the time being scared from one day to another, scared of what could happen any moment. But I don't want to leave you with a pessimistic impression. So let me tell you about what's happened over the last 5 years, at least for me, what I've seen over the last 5 years, and how it's changed my perspective. We already have evidence that within the next 20-30 years, our nutrition will have changed. We will eat different kinds of food, and the source of our nutrition will be completely different in 20-30 years from now. I don't know if you've heard it. Probably you have, because this is something that has been made known all around the world. I'm talking about laboratory-made meat, artificially made meat. There's no name for it, but I'm talking about the way to make meat in a laboratory by means of copying stem cells. And stem cells can be copied, and based on them, something can be made, something can be produced that will be like poultry or like beef, but actually it's going to be really meat. It's really going to be meat, not something artificial. And there are companies who already do that, and they are quite effective at that. Until very recently, costs of production used to be huge, so these products could not be marketed. But actually right now, we're this close to getting to price points that are comparable to animal-based meat. I'm talking about animal-based meat as it's been produced in the last 10 or so thousands of years. And this could change a lot, this laboratory-made meat. Imagine that maybe we will not need to breed cattle anymore and still be able to eat meat. 76 to 70% of arable land in the world is used to grow plants that will be made into animal feeds. So think about it. It's 75% of arable land. So imagine if we don't have to do this because our meat is made in laboratories. Imagine what capabilities, what possibilities will open up if this were to happen. Somewhere between 18 to 20% of greenhouse gases come from cattle, and I'm mostly talking about cows. So again, we can here make environmental gains because there will be less greenhouse gases. And I think that these changes will happen sooner than we think. I would even venture saying that it'll be a revolution, a nutritional, dietary revolution. And it could be, maybe we'll be able to compare it to the agricultural revolution, namely when agriculture was first applied. So this is what I believe in. This laboratory-made meat, it's something that American companies, Israeli companies, focus on also English and Dutch companies, and of course they want to make money from it. Therefore, I'm sure that access to these products will not be easy, and we could see that during the pandemic. Countries, instead of creating conglomerates to produce vaccines, were actually giving a lot of money to huge pharma companies so that they could buy those vaccines from them. So something similar could happen here. Something that's practically the same could happen here. And how is it possible that such a major concern in biology and nutritional sciences, how come that such major concerns are left to companies to decide, while companies mostly need profits and are interested in profits, not in people getting the benefits? Because of this, all the necessary change is not happening. And it seems to me that we should require from our decision makers to take care of major relevant problems like hunger, just like we put pressure on them to take care of the environment. We should have the capacity to demand from them to take care of important things. But in order to put pressure on them, we have to care. Many of us have to care. Because only then can we create enough political pressure, enough political momentum to put the topic of hunger and food on their agenda. So that, for example, if someone runs for mayor, even in a small village or small municipality in this country, simply could not get elected without having some agenda related to combating hunger and food crisis. Thank you. If you have any questions, I will gladly take them.
Thank you very much. We will take some questions from the audience, and I also have some questions which were posted on the internet, on the chat. But do we have some questions from the audience now? So, right here. I will translate the question into English, or yeah. Czy mamy mikrofon na sali?
Do we have a mic in the room? Let me start by thanking you for the fantastic lecture. It's been a pleasure to listen to you live.
Magnificent lecture. It is a pleasure to listen to you live, even in this online form.
I have a question, because usually when we think about hunger, we have a vision of an underfed child or a community where there's not enough
usually
food.
When we are thinking about hunger, we have a vision of a malnutrition child.
Ale wiemy, że pojawia się coś
But
takiego
we know
jak podwójne brzemię dożywienia, czyli mamy do czynienia z
that
dziećmi,
what happened
które
is the double
jednocześnie
burden
są
of
niedożywione,
malnutrition.
ale
So we
też
have
są
children
otyłe.
who are
I mamy
both
But there
underfed
exists such a
and
phenomenon
also
as a
overweight.
burden of
double burden of malnutrition.
double malnutrition. So the children who are not properly fed, but at the same time they are obese.
I zastanawiam się, czy starczy nam
And I was
empatii,
thinking whether we
żeby
can find
spojrzeć
enough
na ten
empathy to
problem,
take a look at this problem
tak samo, z taką samą powagą jak na te dzieci.
just as seriously as at the children who are actually suffering from malnutrition, because both of them are actually victims of the same dysfunctional feeding policy. So can we find this empathy?
Whether we will have enough empathy to them to understand that they are victims of the same incorrect alimentary policy.
Sí, es interesante. La pregunta.
Yes, it is interesting. I mean, the question, I usually say that obesity is actually the malnutrition of the more richer countries, just as hunger is in the poorer countries. So these are actually two facets of the same situation in different countries, in different societies. But, well, of course, obesity stems from the consumption of junk foods. So, where people basically stuff their bellies instead of eating healthy and ensuring the necessary nutrients, and they deform their bodies or disfigure their bodies. Now, there's a problem, a grave problem of obesity in many countries, especially richer countries, and the problem of hunger is not treated with enough seriousness. In the US, where there is the largest proportion of obese people in the world, most probably, I think it's a third of the population. It's a tremendously extended situation. They are very much preoccupied by obesity because this is something that affects them, and they have a perfect situation in the system, and they waste thousands of billions of dollars that they lose in the American health protection system because of obesity. However, they're not as concerned in making sure that countries or regions that are poorer than them can get enough food. Well, it's quite interesting the way you phrased it in the case of empathy towards obesity, because it's actually, it wasn't so long ago, because being fat or overweight was a symbol of richness. Well, so it was good to be fat. It was to be the gentleman. Also in the West. So the bourgeois was always caricatured as a fat person with an unbuttoned jacket. So in Latin America and definitely in Africa, the fat person is also rich. Not so much in the US, because people try to keep themselves as lean as possible. However, in a city of upstate New York, well, there was such a person. It was a typical town for the entire region of the north of the US, where there are major industrial plants that worked very well 20 or 30 years ago. Then they went bust and the production was transferred to China. And all of a sudden it turned out that those people became poor. And in that very town or city, there were IBM headquarters. And those computers were, first of all, manufactured for military purposes. It was a very significant town. And all of a sudden, that town became much poorer. And a major proportion of obese people appeared there, and people did not realize why they were criticized. They were so happy eating their hamburgers, drinking Coke, and saying, who are those people? Those crazy ones who keep coming and telling us that there's something bad about being fat. And well, first of all, it was about the change in the mentality. Actually, no authorities in the US took that thing seriously. I mean, the awareness and the change of awareness that the consumption of hamburgers or other junk food was not the right thing to do, that it should be replaced by fruit and vegetables and other kinds of food. But since they had no money for that, they ate what they could afford. So that empathy is quite a complex issue. However, in numerous poor countries, being fat or obese is still a sign of richness.
Another question from the chat. We discard of great amounts of food. Do you think that the European Union, within its common agricultural policy, can influence on reducing this waste of food, or whether the European Union could or should have develop some programs to hand over the excess food to countries like Niger?
Sí, es muy correcta la pregunta, porque el asunto es que, efectivamente, en Europa se calcula que descartamos 1/3 de la comida que circula.
Indeed, in Europe, many people say that 1/3 of the entirety of food manufacturing just goes to waste. We simply throw out our food, a lot of it. In supermarket, people believe that some of the food is expired. Sometimes we just shop without much caution, so we let food go to waste in our homes, in our refrigerators. And well, this is terrible, that so much food gets wasted. 1/3 of world's production goes to waste. In many countries, actions have been taken to prevent that. And I would say France is leading the way, along with Italy. These countries are running a very good policy, at least when we're talking about food waste prevention. They run deliberate policies. But the problem is that, and actually you said it in your question, namely, a lot of malnutrition in the world is happening outside of Europe. But the fact that we recover food in Italy or in France, the fact that we stop wasting so much food in Europe doesn't mean that this food will go to Honduras, Bangladesh or Brazil. So even if we stop wasting food, probably it will not go to the places where it's so much needed. I would say markets adjust to lower demand. if people waste less, then they will buy less. So in the midterm, it may lead to maybe shifting production somewhere else, or production manufacturers' profiles will change, but we don't know. However, it's wonderful that we try to prevent food waste. But even if we waste less food, it will not directly improve the situation of people who suffer from malnutrition.
I'm optimistic about the vision of producing artificial meat. But I have two questions which are skeptical about the idea. So the first question is, doesn't the proposal to produce this artificial meat, doesn't it reverse us to the problem of the concentration of production? Can you see, or can you envision any possibilities of changes to the model of consumption instead? For instance, reducing the consumption of meat, or the change of the model of production. And another question regarding this meat production, if you argue that these reducing the production of animals will leave some area of farming land free for producing food for people, for humans, it may happen that it doesn't bring as big profit. So this land, which in theory would be freed, will not be cultivated.
Will not be cultivated? Why?
Would not be cultivated, this land.
But why? Why would it not be cultivated? I didn't understand that last part.
Because it brings less profit than growing. Yeah.
Well, a ver, para empezar, no es some area, un poco de alguna área, digamos que, como decía recién,
Well, we're not talking about any piece of land that could be arable land. I'm talking about 75% of arable land in the world. 70% of this land goes towards production of animal feeds. So this is how much land goes towards this purpose. So if some of this land is freed, or a lot of this land is freed, this would be very beneficial, especially for those who are in grave need of nutrition. But of course, for this, we need political will. Without political will, nothing will change. But what's important is for us to have the right tools, the right instruments to make sure that this political will also translates into action. But first of all, we need to generate, let's say, or spark some political will into existence. When it comes to consumption profile or consumption models, we need to change that. Of course, the model of consumption that we have right now is untenable and unsustainable. For most of human history, meat was rare as a product. Most of humanity rarely had meat. Whenever they had meat, that was very special, a special occasion. And always meat was accompanied by carbohydrates, fruits and vegetables. So actually meat, even if happened to appear on the table, it was just a small part of a bigger meal composed of carbohydrates and fruits and vegetables. But then for some time, in wealthy countries, this proportion has changed. We eat a lot of meat with a tiny bit of vegetables on the side. So the proportions have changed. We have a steak and some fries, a lot of animal proteins, and a little bit of carbohydrates. And in wealthy countries, that's the model. This is what's happening. This is common, which is crazy. In 50 years, in 100 years from now, when people go back and read what we're eating right now, they'd find it unbelievable. Because the carnivore model, the carnivorous model, is just not rational. And because of that, there are so many people, so many social groups. Think about China 40 years ago. In China 40 years ago, people ate grams of meat a year, and now they consume 50 kilograms of meat a year instead of single grams. An explosion of meat consumption has started. But it's all based on one condition, namely, only a small fraction of humanity can afford that model of consumption. The world cannot afford for 50% of its people to eat the same way as people eat in wealthy, affluent countries. We here are the ones who can afford those quantities of meat. But think about also about the number of cars that we're driving. It's unsustainable either. In Africa, in India, in China, if they had the same proportion of cars as we have in Europe or in the States, the world would go up in flames. There are many models that could work and work only because they are used by a small fraction of humanity. Many people would love to have that, to have what we have. But if everyone had that, it would be absolutely impossible to maintain. So we need to look for other models. So I think that maybe 30, 40 years from now, this system of a meal that's mostly based on animal proteins and only a tiny bit of vegetables on the side will be just unthinkable.
I will have a question from the audience, so please.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture. I have a question regarding the funds that are being released from the European Union and quite a lot of money being poured into creating startups that will solve the food problems. So I'm curious if this is really something that continues to support the system as it is, or if you have any examples of enterprises or small ventures that really make an impact and are a route of hope for us.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand what you were asking. I'm so sorry.
Nie ma możliwości przełączenia na hiszpański tam. Musiałaby pani powtórzyć po angielsku.
No, there's no way of switching into Spanish.
Okay, so I can repeat. I can try to repeat.
You have to repeat it.
There are money being released from the European Union, and there are funds for startups, for creators and people with ideas to solve food problems across the globe. So I'm curious if you have if you've seen any examples of those organizations or individuals or teams that are really making an impact at the moment, or is it still something that is sort of a band-aid and really supports the system as it is?
No termino de entender, pero Yo lo siento, no sé cómo están
I'm sorry.
las empresas que
I'm not
reciben
sure
esos fondos
how companies
de la
function
Unión
that
Europea.
receive such form of aid from the European Union.
En Israel,
I know that, for instance, in
está dando
Israel,
dinero para
they earn money
algunas de estas startups que están
or
trabajando
appropriate funds to support those laboratories that produce artificial meat. Or for instance, so such startups, at least 30% of their profits are not lost. Well, if they keep functioning as a startup rather than going bust. So basically, well, they get the money and, well, they have to justify their place and what they're doing. But anyway, such companies that I've been in contact with in Israel are pursuing such kind of development, and they receive money to start the R&D. However, if they manage to advance and they're successful, they are no longer beneficiaries. They don't get money for nothing. On the other hand, there are multi-missionaries who started doing something meaningful and who managed to bring their companies to the moment of making millions. So there are cases like that. And they didn't pursue it for a social reason, they just did it for an economic reason, basically to make profit.
I think we have another question from the audience.
Krzysztof, ja zadam po polsku, dobrze? Żeby
Tylko
tak wszyscy...
proszę mi pozwolić.
I will ask it in
Mówił pan,
Polish.
że model żywienia oparty na takiej nadmiernej konsumpcji białka zwierzęcego, jedzenia mięsa jest szkodliwy i właśnie przyczynia się do tego stanu rzeczy, jaki mamy.
Animal protein. A model of consumption which is based on eating meat and animal protein is dysfunctional, and it causes the situation that we have now.
Ale widzimy, że dzisiaj ten model częściowo jest wypierany właśnie przez inny model, coraz więcej ludzi nie je mięsa.
But today, more and more people refrain from eating meat.
Tak, ja sama nie jem mięsa, w moim otoczeniu jest bardzo wiele wegetarian, wegan. W supermarketach teraz są osobne półki, właściwie już w każdym supermarkecie, w każdej sieciówce nawet są półki z jedzeniem wegetariańskim i wegańskim.
Myself, I don't eat food, and I have many friends who don't. I don't eat meat, and have many friends who are vegetarians, and in every supermarket you have a special vegetarian section.
Więc ja mam poczucie, że coś się zmienia też w sposobie produkowania żywności, ale zastanawiam się, czy to jest też, czy ten model też nie niesie niebezpieczeństw ze sobą i czy pan się nad tym zastanawiał, czy pan badał ten problem, jakie niebezpieczeństwa mogą się wiązać z takim modelem.
So this model of this let's say vegetarian model is becoming more and more popular, but I'm curious whether this model brings any new risks with it, and do you have can you reflect on it?
Tym bardziej, że kiedy patrzymy na te produkty wegetariańskie, wegańskie, one są robione często z niewiadomego, z różnych dziwnych składników, więc ja mówię, takie pytanie się pojawia, czy to też nie jest szkodliwe i dla środowiska, i dla człowieka.
So we are not quite sure what are these products are made of, and whether it brings any risks for the environment and people.
Yeah. Which product do you mean?
Znaczy ogólnie pytanie jest takie, czy A produkty, no różne wegetariańskie kotlety, tak, no różne wegetariańskie, wegańskie.
Vegetarian steaks.
Can you see risks connected with this change of model towards the vegetarian diet?
Czy to też ma, jakie to może nieść ryzyka? Czy po prostu, czy to jest badane, czy nie? Czy się tym pan też zajmował?
Is it being investigated? Have you dealt with that?
What did you say?
Yeah.
Whether you also investigated this problem of the new models of
the risk,
new dietary models and risk connected with them.
No, yo no he investigado eso.
No, I haven't.
Trabajé, bueno, el hambre hace unos años, sigo manteniéndome informado sobre eso.
I've been dealing with hunger for many years, dealing with and receiving up-to-date information. However, I'm not a specialist in terms of nutrition, that's for sure. The topic of hunger seems fundamental to me, but I should really not be treated as a specialist in terms of nutrition, like I said. So that's what I said when I was talking about meat. Well, you definitely don't have to kill many more animals to produce more meat. Well, that's the reason why many people have converted to vegetarianism, because they think it's not proper to kill animals to produce meat. I mean, you can just produce meat based on stem cells. Well, this is still a rather obscure issue. It has not been calculated, because this process also requires some energy, so it should also be taken into account. All those things that go on in the laboratories and the probes and so on, or tubes, should be taken account of. However, I'm not a vegetarian, I'm Argentinian. However, I respect people who are vegetarian. However, the society is involved in the very important model of nutrition, and I think the most vegetarian country, which is India, is also the most cruel, one of the most cruel countries. Well, so basically, it's a country with it's the country which has the largest proportion of vegetarian people in terms of percentage, and at the same time there is the largest number of people who don't eat enough or don't eat properly. So it's not a solution to the problem of famine. On the other hand, in Western countries, there's a certain trend that has been reinforced very much in the latest years, but how those countries, well, for instance, in terms of the social and cultural segments of the society, they have found the right way of workflow in terms of the food in those countries, and sometimes this can become a form of a privilege. To buy organic tomato can be 3 times more expensive than buying a regular tomato. So it's a question of making money. The same thing that happens to those U.S. citizens who laugh when offered a salad. Well, they could. However, it's a question of promoting some forms of consumption that is much more respectful to the nature and to animals, but it's just a privilege of sectors. It basically, and there is a reason for that. It costs much more expensive to grow tomatoes in a special garden rather than in terms of mass production.
We have a question from the chat which returns to the political aspects of hunger. The question is, and what about the United Nations food programs? Are they passive or do they something wrong?
Bueno, las Naciones Unidas tiene dos grandes unidades dedicadas al tema de la alimentación, como ustedes saben, ¿no? La FAO.
The UN has two major entities devoted to that. That's FOE, the World Food Organization, and the World Food Program. FAO deals with it on the organizational basis, on a general basis. It provides consultancy on how food should be produced globally. It also calculates the statistics regarding hunger in the world. We are aware of those figures owing to FAO, but they do it in a dubious way, actually, because the ways of calculation change in an unheard of way. Every couple of years, FAO discovers that the previous calculations have been inappropriate and the entire methodology needs to be changed, and everything that has been discussed so far needs to be turned upside down.
When years ago it became obvious that around 25 years ago, instead of 600 million people affected by hunger, as FAO estimated, it turned out that there was over 1 billion. And then they changed their calculation method, so actually FAO statistics mostly serve themselves and the organization itself. On the other hand, FAO really very much depends on the statistical data that it's getting from the UN member states. And those countries, those UN countries that have major hunger problem, are the countries where it's the most difficult to get data. But actually there's no other data. So the data that we have sort of indicates certain trends. Something is increasing, something is decreasing. And the number of people suffering from famine has drastically risen recently because of the pandemic, then because of the inflation, right now the war. Yeah, the number of people suffering from hunger is growing. But according to FAO, it's not the case. And the World Food Program is running interventions in specific countries. Countries that are in crisis are countries where they can deliver their assistance. So to those places, they can effectively and immediately deliver food. And for this reason, there is no long-term and sort of very drastic. There are no long-term, very drastic periods of hunger. So people who die of hunger these days, they don't die because they haven't eaten for 20 or 30 days in a row. They die because they live longer, but still they die too soon because they've been malnourished for years and years. So their bodies are simply in a bad way. And, for example, they cannot stave off regular infections. So infections that would not pose any danger to anyone who is well fed, maybe killing malnourished people. So the WFO definitely, or the World Food Organization, the World Food Program, definitely is an organization that we can be thankful for. Definitely there are many other organizations, charitable organizations, who help and deliver food to the needy, but it's like a band-aid being put on a huge gaping wound. So yes, they are helping in a given place at a given time, but without solving the underlying problem. And the World Food Program, it reaches places that are in conflict or in crisis. So it's very much ad hoc assistance rather than solving the underlying problem.
No, all right. So the last question from the chat. Some of our listeners were intrigued by this monument, which was financed by a French company in Warsaw. You mentioned. Was it perhaps the monument to General de Gaulle?
No, as I said before, como dije, es un monumento a Marie Curie, la gran científica polaca, no me acuerdo ahora el apellido de soltera.
Oh, okay. No, it's a monument for Marie Curie. I couldn't remember the name, but that's the Polish Nobel Prize laureate in the 20th century, Marie Curie. She actually worked on radiation. She worked on chemical elements. So it's clear that a company that produces uranium funds a monument in her hometown. It was a French company that mines for uranium. Actually, they were the founders of the monument, of the statue. And actually, Marie Skłodowska-Curie was doing the research. As I was walking around Warsaw, I just found this statue, this monument. I just noticed a plaque saying that this and that company, a French company, co-funded the statue, the monument of Marie Skłodowska-Curie. I don't remember if the plaque was in Polish or in French, but I'm sure you can find the place.
Thank you very much for your fascinating lecture. Thank you for being with us and answering our questions. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm sorry to have me here, but anyway, I tried to be even in this strange way. Dziękuję and see you next time.